Hi class, I hope everyone had a good break. Today in this lecture we're going to talk about some of the basics for the last unit including concepts and terminology. So that's why I wanted to do this as a separate video because there's kind of a lot of stuff, um, but it'll help us to get big picture of what we're doing for the last unit, and big picture is a really good way to start understanding. So notice the last unit is on natural theology. Now, first of all, it's going to be a kind of cool but a little bit complex unit because we're going to combine some of our conceptual analysis stuff from Unit 2 with some of the more specific argument evaluation stuff from Unit 1. But in terms of what we're talking about, and this is really, really important, most common mistake on the final exam is talking about the wrong kind of thing. So to help us avoid that, we need to distinguish between what is sometimes called natural theology and revealed theology. So theology, theos, logos, to give an account of God or gods. But what's the distinction between natural and revealed? Well, let's start with revealed. Revealed is learning truths about God or gods through revealed sources, such as revealed texts like the Tanakh or Christian Bible or Bhagavad Gita or whatever, or through prophecy or religious experience, that kind of thing. It's called special theology, special revelation, because not everyone has access to it. And so that's what's called revealed theology. Now, here's the really, really, really important thing. We are not doing revealed theology in this class. There's lots of good stuff. If you want to talk about that kind of thing, I strongly encourage you to take Comparative World Religions, Introduction to World Religions, etc. Tons of good stuff in revealed theology. Having said that, if you start talking about revealed theology on the final, that's not really any different than talking about the reproductivity of yeast on the final. It's just the wrong class. That's not what we're doing. So set all that aside, and we'll talk a little more about that in a second, and focus on natural theology. Natural theology is trying to learn truth about God or gods using universal sources, specifically the senses and reason. So that's the basis for philosophy of religion. That's what we're going to be doing. And by the way, that is a religiously neutral term. If, as it turns out, the truth about the gods or gods we learn is that there are none, that would still fall under natural theology, weird as it sounds. So, make sure you're focusing on natural theology using evidence and argument. And let me just say a little more about that, just in case it makes you feel squeamish. Let's say you want to put some serious emphasis on some revealed text like the Christian Bible. Well, though the revealed texts don't stand up as historical texts, which means if we are to trust them, we have to know that some sort of divine being inspired them. But notice that means that, well, first I have to figure out whether there is a divine being of a certain description or not in order to know if they inspired such texts. So you have to do natural theology first anyway. So hopefully that takes the sting out of things a little bit. So make sure you know the distinction between natural theology and revealed theology. Any more questions, comments on that? Love to hear about it in the discussion boards. Let's talk about a couple of other important concepts. Within natural theology, there's a lot of different concepts of higher powers, in case you didn't know. One of the more important ones, and ones we'll talk about a lot, is sometimes called the God of theism, or just God with a capital G. This is a specific description of a higher power. That's why it's a capital G. It has to fit a specific description. This would be a being that is sometimes called maximally perfect. That is a being that is essentially omnipotent or all-powerful, omniscient or all-knowing, morally perfect. And we'll talk more about that later. But is also a creator deity and is eternal and is personal. By personal in philosophy, we mean is a person in the sense that they are conscious, they make decisions, they have intent. So don't think personal means your buddy. Personal means has a consciousness. Um, so if you're talking about that kind of being, you're talking about the God of theism, the God of the omnis. Now, interestingly enough, stop and think about what is the relationship between the God of theism and sometimes called the God of the philosophers and revealed theology. A lot of religions actually agree on that. So Christians will say, "Yeah, that's my God." Muslims will say, "Yeah, that's my God." Um, Hare Krishnas will say, "Yeah, that's my God." Some Jews will say, "Yeah, that's my God." And so notice that natural theology is religiously neutral. We're talking about something much more basic. So quite a few religions agree on that point. Where are they going to disagree? Where such a being interacts with the world and how. So that's God of theism. Now notice you could believe in a higher power and not believe in the God of theism. So for instance, if you think that the God is not morally perfect, say is vengeful or angry or what have you, then that would not be a God of theism. And this will be important because, as we will see, different arguments support different descriptions of the deity. But there's lots of descriptions of higher powers, so you need to be kind of specific about what higher power you're talking about. On the other end of the spectrum, all the way down, atheist naturalism. An atheist naturalist, you'll hear me say that a lot, because there there are so many different descriptions of deities, you might deny some, not others, and further, you can say deny all gods but still support the supernatural. There's as many religious views as there as are almost imaginable. But the atheist naturalist is on the far, far, far low end of the spectrum in terms of denying any supernatural entities. Um, Everything that exists is the universe and the relationship and the relations between the things in the universe. So think of a broad spectrum of religious beliefs, with one end of the spectrum, kind of the most religious belief in terms of a higher power is the God of theism, and the least would be the atheist naturalist with nothing at all. But there's lots of views in between, so you really have to be careful with your terminology. Remember your lessons from the Youth of Road. You don't assert more than the evidence supports. So, for instance, the first kind of arguments we're going to look at try to argue that there's a higher power. And I finish my sentence. That's it. They try to show that there's some sort of first being. And so notice, even if that argument's successful, you'd still have a lot more work to do if you want to say that that first being is, say, a good God or an omnipotent God, etc. So arguments can support one description, not others, or arguments can count against one description, not others. One of the things we're going to talk about at the end of the semester is an argument called the problem of evil, which is only a problem for someone who wants to support a God that is both morally perfect, that is a good God, and omnipotent. For anybody else, even if they believe in a higher power, there is no problem with evil. So these descriptions are very important in terms of what is supported and what isn't. So we will start looking at some of those supports later this week. It is helpful, though, again, big picture, to talk about some of the commonalities between these kind of arguments, and so I'd like to say a few words about that. It might seem unrelated, but it's not. But we need to talk about different claims about truths. And this is a distinction between a priori and a posteriori. So this is the type of thing you might want to look up on your own if this goes a little fast. So, but it's a distinction in between what kind of truth something is. An a priori truth is knowable independently of any experience. So it's something we know to be true, but we don't need experience to know that it's true. What kinds of things are that? Not many. But conceptual truths, like a bachelor is an unmarried male, mathematical truths, such as 2 plus 2 is 4, and truths of logic, such as some of the valid inferences we talked about in Unit 1. Those are pretty much the only things that are a priori truths. What's their hallmark? They're knowable independently of experience. Notice I didn't say known, because we all learn that 2 plus 2 is 4 by someone telling us. That's experience. But the point is, we didn't need to learn it that way. One proof, what's 6 trillion plus 2? 6 trillion 2, and that's probably the first time you've ever encountered that fact, and yet you figured out the answer without any further prompting. So those are a priori truths. Those are very rare. Everything else is what is called a posteriori. So a priori has the word prior in it, before experience with the world. A posteriori has posterior in it, only after the experience with the world. So what kind of things are a posteriori truths? Everything else. So all the truths of the sciences, anything based on cause and effect inference, which is the sciences, anything based on sensory experience, such as Mickey is wearing a shirt, or memory. Those are all a posteriori truths, etc. So that's a distinction. Why does that matter? Because people try to argue higher powers in different ways. So the last thing we're going to do in this video is talk about 3 big families of natural theology arguments. So these are 3 types of argument aimed at trying to conclude that there's a higher power. And again, if this goes a little fast, feel free to follow up in the discussion or to just Google around on your own. I'm not reinventing the wheel here. There's tons of stuff out there on these concepts. So first is a group called ontological arguments. Very big picture, what they try to do is argue that something about the concept or essence of God implies that that being must exist. As such, they are deductive and a priori. Now, you might notice, if you're looking at your syllabus, that we don't talk about ontological arguments in this course. There's 2 reasons for that. One, they're not terribly popular. Most people, and I don't just mean atheists, I mean most people, including theists, don't think they work because they seem to be trying to define something into existence. Having said that, that's not the main reason that we don't talk about them in the course. The main reason is they're hard. They tend to require backgrounds in either metaphysics or modal logic, depending on which version you go to, and they're just not really conducive to an introductory course. But they're interesting. I wrote a master's thesis on them, so I certainly think they're interesting. So if you are interested, go poke around some more. Having said that, the other 2 types are the ones we will be talking about in this course. The second type of argument is a cosmological argument, which I've already hinted at a little bit. Cosmological arguments take some very, very, very basic fact about the world, and by very basic, you'll sometimes hear something like pre-scientific, and try to show that that very basic fact about the world tries to imply some sort of first being. So as such, they are a posteriori, because you still need to know that basic fact about the world, but they are deductive as a general rule. So what kind of arguments are these? We're going to read a bunch of them in Aquinas. Actually, Aquinas gives 5 argument forms, and 4 of them are cosmological. But as an example, you'll notice that Aquinas' first argument starts with the fact that there is motion, that stuff moves. You don't need to know science to know that. It's a pre-scientific, basic metaphysical fact about the world. Stuff moves. And then they're going to try to show that that implies a first being, specifically an unmoved mover. And so that's the kind of things that are cosmological arguments. So when you're reading the Aquinas for our next class, first of all, pay attention. Let's say a few things now about Aquinas. I apologize. So you're getting ready to read the Aquinas as the next reading. It's a little tricky reading if you don't know what's going on. So first of all, Aquinas writes like Aristotle in some ways, which means he says, here's a question. Here's a reason why people have said yes. Here's a reason why some people have answered no. Lastly, here's what I think. So watch the other yes nos first, because Aquinas actually isn't giving his own views, he's talking about other people. So the question Aquinas is going to start with in the reading is, independent of revelation, that is, using only natural theology, can we show that there is a God? Then he's going to say, here's a reason some people said yes. And you know what arguments he talks about? The ontological arguments. And there you'll have Aquinas, St. Thomas Aquinas, telling you that ontological arguments don't work. That's what I mean when I say a lot of people don't support them. And then he'll say, here's why some people have said no, and then we'll get a little bit of prelude to the problem of evil. And then lastly, you'll get the here's what I think. And the here's what I think are going to be 5 argument forms called the 5 ways, or Aquinas' 5 ways. First of all, notice I keep saying argument forms. It's important to realize 2 things about this reading. First of all, it's from a massive work called the Summa Theologia, thousands of pages, and it wasn't finished when he died. He was basically trying to explain all of the beliefs of the Catholic Church using Aristotelian philosophical framework. Really interesting work. It's actually it's a project called scholasticism. If you're wondering where the word scholar comes from, it's named after Thomas Aquinas' work. So obviously this guy is not an idiot. But people tend to think that the arguments are a little bad, and that's because you misread them. He doesn't say, here's 5 arguments. He says, here's 5 ways we could argue. Aquinas is writing for other Christian monks, specifically Catholic monks. He's not writing for atheist naturalists, and so these are not meant as conversion pieces. These are meant as just quick on a note card, here's an approach you could do if you wanted to. And that should be as far as you're reading the Aquinas. So to take these as intended as persuasive pieces, you're just reading it wrong. So don't give unfair criticisms of Aquinas when you're reading. But he gives 5 ways we could argue using natural theology. 4 of those ways are cosmological arguments. And as per the review sheet, we're really going to focus on the first and second way. I will mention the other 3 ways. So that's what to watch for in Aquinas. He is doing cosmological arguments, which means, again, big picture. That means these arguments are going to start with some very general fact about the world, try to show that deductively that general fact about the world implies some sort of first meaning. And we'll unpack cosmological arguments a little more in the next video. But I said there were 3 families of natural theology arguments we're going to talk about. The last one are known as design arguments, sometimes teleological arguments. These try to show that some very specific, usually a scientific fact about the world, imply a designer or an intelligence. And so very specific facts about the world. Paley, who we're going to read later, gives one from the structure of the human eye. And they tend to go in terms of arguments from analogy. They don't always, but the best ones are arguments from analogy. And so as such, they are inductive and a posteriori. So they take a fact about the world, structure of the human eye, say that makes it very likely that there is a designer, something with human-like intelligence in the relevant ways. So that's some big picture background for natural theology and what we're doing in the final unit, where we're bringing together argument and conceptual analysis. This is an extended introduction, I know, and I really want you to kind of work with it, so make sure that you're posting in the introductory discussion as well as the ones from the further readings in this section. Otherwise, we will see you next time with Aquinas, especially the first and second way. See you then.